Hello and welcome to the West Partnership Learning videos. These are for health and food technology at a higher level, and in this series of lessons we'll recap and build on your knowledge of nutrition. The last lesson in the series will give you exam style questions to work on, and I'll give you perfect answers, but it's important that we make sure that you've got the knowledge and understanding of nutrition, make sure that's sound first. As you watch the video, please make sure that you're taking notes to revise from. You can pause and you can rewind the video at any point. So let's get started. So today's lesson is on macronutrients. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to identify the food sources of protein, carbohydrate and fat, and you should be able to explain the effects on health of having protein, carbohydrate and fat in the diet. To be able to explain effectively, you have to give a fact about the nutrient and a consequence of having that nutrient in the diet. Macronutrients are nutrients that are needed in large quantities by the body. At a higher level, you have to be able to show an understanding of the functions, the job that the nutrient does in the body, and you have to be able to give an impact on health of having these nutrients in the diet. Okay, so I'm going to start off with protein. So the function of protein in the body, the job that it does in our body, is it's needed for growth, repair and maintenance of body cells and tissues. That's its main function. Then, once it's been used for that function, it's used as a source of energy. Proteins are made up of amino acids. Essential amino acids can't be made by the body, so they have to come from the foods that we eat. So proteins can be split into two sections. We've got animal proteins and plant proteins. Animal proteins, or HBV, or high biological value proteins, they contain all of the essential amino acids. Plant proteins are LBV proteins, or low biological value, and they lack one or more of the essential amino acids. HBV proteins can come from the meat of the animal or the animal's byproducts, things like milk or cheese. Plant proteins come from sources such as chickpeas, beans and lentils. Soyabeans are an exception to the rule, so they are actually classed as HBV proteins because they contain all of the essential amino acids. So they're a really good source for a vegetarian because they do come from a plant, but they contain all the essential amino acids. Corn products as well, they've been developed as an alternative to meat products, and they also contain all the essential amino acids. They're HBV proteins too. So they are another good source for a vegetarian. So what's the impact on health of having enough or not having enough protein in the diet? So after protein's been used for its main function of growth, repair and maintenance of body cells and tissues, it's then used as a source of energy. So if that energy isn't used up, if it's not used through exercise, then it'll be converted to fat, which can result in weight gain, and that can then result in obesity and complications such as coronary heart disease. A lack of protein can result in slow healing of cuts and wounds, and that could lead to infection of that cut. And it can lead to poor growth in children as well. So everyone needs protein, but we need it in different quantities and for different reasons. So children and teenagers, they are going through massive growth spurts, so they need protein to support that. They're also very active, so they could be likely to fall and damage themselves. They could be likely to have a cut or a wound from the activities that they're doing. So they will need it for repair as well. Adults are no longer growing, so they don't need it for that purpose, but they will need it to repair any damaged muscle, for example, after exercise, and to maintain their skin, their hair and their nails, etc. Elderly people can be unsteady on their feet. They can have poor eyesight, so they might be more likely to fall. So they'll need protein to repair the damaged cells and tissues after a fall. Pregnant women only need a little extra protein to support the developing fetus. Too much protein could result in the excess energy from that protein being stored as fat, which can result in weight gain, which can be dangerous for a pregnant woman. So I said to explain effectively, you have to be able to give a fact about the nutrient and a consequence of having it in the diet. So over the next few slides, I'm going to give you the consequences for specific stages in life or different scenarios of having too much or too little protein in that person's diet. So the consequences will be specifically linked to, in this case, an elderly person and a child. So an elderly person has more protein than required. What's the consequence for that elderly person? And a child has less protein than required. What's the consequence for that child? So just now what I want you to do is to pause the video. I want you to have a think about that yourself first. What do you think the consequence is going to be for each of these people? So for an elderly person, as elderly people are less active, the excess energy that they don't use will be stored as fat, which results in weight gain. So that consequence there is specific to an elderly person. The bit that's in bold there can only be said about an elderly person. We couldn't say that about a child, we couldn't say that about a teenager. It's specific to an elderly person. And then similarly with the child, as children are very active, playing at school, they often fall and cut themselves. The lack of protein will result in slow healing of cuts and wounds. So that, again, the bold bit there is specifically linked to the person that I want to talk about. So I can't use that consequence for anyone else. It's specific for a child. Okay, so moving on now to carbohydrate. The main function of carbohydrate is to supply energy for all bodily functions and activities. That could be for exercise or even anything as simple as breathing and blinking, things like that we need energy for. Carbohydrate can also supply warmth to maintain our body temperature at around 37 degrees. So just like protein, carbohydrates can be split into two sources sections. So we've got our starchy carbohydrates or complex carbohydrates like bread, rice and pasta. A lot of starchy carbohydrates will also provide us with fibre, which we're going to cover in detail in one of our other lessons. Then we've got our sugary carbohydrates like sweets, biscuits and cakes, all the things that we like. But you've also got fruits and vegetables in that category as well that many people wouldn't really consider containing sugar. So the sugar in fruit and vegetables is intrinsic sugar. It's already in there. They're already naturally found in the food. Whereas the refined sugar or free sugars are extrinsic sugars. They're added to products to make them taste sweeter. Too much carbohydrate in the diet will result in an excess of energy being stored in the body. So if we've not used the energy from the carbohydrate, it's going to be stored in the body, which results in weight gain. And that can lead to obesity and complications like coronary heart disease. Too little carbohydrate in the diet would mean that we've got a lack of energy. So this can result in tiredness and it can lead to weight loss as well. Again, everyone needs carbohydrate, but for different reasons. So children and teenagers are usually very active, so they need energy to allow them to take part in their sports and their activities without them becoming tired. The amount of carbohydrate that adults need will vary depending on how much exercise that they do, or even the type of job that they do. So some people are more physically active than others, so will need more energy. Elderly people are generally less active than younger people, so they might be housebound, for example, so they'll need less carbohydrate as their energy needs are lower. Pregnant women need more energy in the last 3 months of their pregnancy, as that's the stage when the fetus develops rapidly. So to help us explain fully the need for carbohydrate in the diet, we need to give a fact about carbohydrate and a detailed consequence linked to the specific person. So for carbohydrate, I've given the examples of an overweight office worker and a gymnast. So what I want you to do now is to pause the video and have a little think about this yourself first. So an overweight office worker has more carbohydrate than is required. What's the consequence for that overweight office worker? So making sure that we are being specific to that person. A gymnast has less carbohydrate than required. What's the consequence for the gymnast? So an overweight office worker will not be active during working hours. The excess energy that they don't use would be stored as fat, resulting in obesity, as he's already overweight. So both of those bold bits are linked very clearly to the person on the slide previous. As the gymnast will be using a lot of energy, the lack of carbohydrate will result in them being tired and unable to take part in their sport. So again, I've been very specific to the person that I was covering in the question. Moving on to fat now. The main function of fat is to provide a concentrated source of energy. It also provides essential fatty acids, which we're going to cover in a bit more detail in the next lesson. And fat can form an insulating layer just underneath the skin to provide warmth. Fats can be split again into two sections. We've got our animal sources and our plant sources. Animal sources are saturated fats, and these are often classed as the bad fats as they raise our LDL cholesterol. This cholesterol blocks the artery to the heart, which can be really dangerous, and we'll cover that again in more detail later. So we should be trying to have more unsaturated fats in our diet, as these increase the good HDL cholesterol, which removes the bad LDL cholesterol to the liver, where it's broken down and it's removed from the body. But again, we'll cover that in more detail when we do a lesson on coronary heart disease. If the energy from the fat is not used, it will result in weight gain, which then leads to obesity and complications like coronary heart disease. And then if we've not got enough fat in our diet, it can result in weight loss, tiredness because we've got a lack of energy, and feeling cold as well because we don't have that insulating layer underneath the skin. So hopefully after this lesson you can now identify the sources of protein, both LBV sources and HBV sources. You should be able to identify the sources of carbohydrate, complex carbohydrates and simple carbohydrates, sugary carbohydrates, and the sources of fat, both saturated and unsaturated. And when explaining the effects on health of macronutrients, you should be able to give a detailed function of each of these nutrients and a consequence of having or not having that nutrient in the diet. Before you go, I'd like you to summarise your learning as a recap. And in our next lesson, we'll be looking in more detail at fat by focusing on the essential fatty acids.